social science matrix. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am the director of UC Berkeley's matrix. Today's event is actually our second interdisciplinary look into the future of money after we did a panel on cryptocurrencies and blockchain a few weeks ago. Today's panel is titled The Future of Money, Mobile Money, Social Media, and Cashless Economies. And we are going to be addressing more specifically the experience of living in a cashless society. You know, how is that transforming the nature of social connections and the way people communicate and exchange with one another? How do mobile payments intersect with the explosion of digital lending and the rise of new, sometimes crushing, forms of indebtedness? What is the impact of demonetization on the poor? How are our relationships between the global north and the global south being reconfigured by the proliferation of digital payment technologies? These are some of the questions that our panelists' research and publications have addressed, and actually that made us reach out to them for today's exciting event. Actually, personally, I couldn't think of a better set of people to engage with this topic. So after today, you will be able to watch a recording of both events on the future of money, along with many other matrix programs on our website. And you can also listen to past events as podcasts. Today's event is part of our Matrix on Point series. It's a series that is promoting focused cross-disciplinary conversations on, you know, the most pressing issues of our present. And we are very happy that the event this event on the future of money is co-sponsored with the Network for New Political Economy, or N2PE, at Berkeley. So let me briefly mention a few other upcoming events that will round out the semester. Next week on April 22nd, we will host an Author Meets Critics panel with Professor Sarah Vaughan. She will discuss her new book, Engineering Vulnerability in Pursuit of Climate Adaptation. On April 25, we will be presenting an important panel featuring 4 distinguished Russian dissident voices on the war in Ukraine and the future of Russia. On April 29, we'll have another Author Meets Critics event, this time featuring Professor Caroline Chen and her new book, Work, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion in Silicon Valley. And finally, on May 5, we will be presenting a panel called Organize, Power and Collective Action, featuring scholars and activists on organizing for social change. All right, so as I'll be moderating the panel today, I'll begin by introducing our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. So first to present will be Kevin Donovan, who is an anthropologist and historian at the University of Edinburgh. He is currently writing a book on the history of economic decolonization in East Africa, focusing on central banks, the politics of price and smuggling. In addition, he and Emma Park are working on a book about digital money, intimate infrastructures, and the corporate state in Kenya. And I highly recommend both his academic articles and his more public essays, such as those written for the Boston Reviews, which are really little jewels. Our next panelist is Lana Swartz. She is assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. Lana, I don't know. Oh, there you are, sorry. She is the author of the new book, fairly new book, New Money, How Payment Became Social Media, and co-author with Bill Moore of Paid, Tales of Dongles, Checks, and Other Money Stuff. And she's currently working on 2 projects, a collaborative project about the promises and perils of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, and she's also working on a book-length project about scams in the digital economy. So welcome, Lana. And then finally, Jayati Ghosh is professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She previously taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for nearly 35 years, and she has authored and or edited 20 books and more than 200 scholarly articles. So I'll just mention a few. Her books include Women Workers in the Informal Economy, Demonetization Decoded, and her forthcoming book is The Making of a Catastrophe, COVID-19 and the Indian Economy. Professor Ghosh has received several prizes, including for distinguished contributions to the social sciences in India, the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Research Prize, and the North-Sud Prize for Social Sciences. So with that, I will hand the floor over to our first presenter, Kevin Donovan, and take it away, Kevin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Marion, and thank you to Julie also for organizing this. I'm just going to set up the screen sharing appropriately. And thank you to Lana for teaching me this. I think that should be properly aligned now, but please feel free to say otherwise if it isn't. Thanks everyone for being here. As Marion suggested, I'm going to speak today about a book project with a colleague, Emma Park, at the New School that we're provisionally calling Parastatal Value and Intimacy in Digital Kenya. And this is a study of the cultural economy and politics surrounding Kenya's largest corporation, Safaricom. Safaricom began as a parastatal began as a telecommunications firm, the result of the partial privatization of state assets. But in the past 2 decades, it's become an enormously profitable and influential financial services provider, an infrastructure owner, and increasingly a broker of digital data. It has an overwhelming dominance in the telecommunications, internet, and mobile money sectors in which it operates. Most famously, it runs M-Pesa, a service launched in 2007 that permits Kenyans to send digital money back and forth, as well as cash in and out of their digital money at a network of kiosks and shops across the country. Pesa is Swahili for money, and M being mobile. Very quickly, after its launch in 2007, M-Pesa was adopted by millions of Kenyans, and today it is ubiquitous, and it is a socially necessary infrastructure of value. M-Pesa is at the center of what is now known as financial inclusion, which is a kind of curious mixture of techno-capitalism and international development that believes banking the unbanked, as they put it, is an essential part of poverty alleviation and improving livelihoods. The roots of financial inclusion are in classical microfinance group lending associated with Muhammad Yunus and others. But the success of M-Pesa brought more attention to the role of digital technologies. And so what is now called fintech, short for financial technology, encompasses a range of services from payments and savings to lending and insurance products. And these take advantage of the inexpensive mobile technology, which many Kenyans have, as well as the proliferation of digital data to incorporate low-income Kenyans into financial circuits. Safaricom is the most important fulcrum in this industry because it has the best access to digital data, and it controls the most common digital payments infrastructure, namely M-Pesa. So as a result, most Kenyan banks now work with Safaricom to offer loans via the phone. These loans used so-called alternative data from digital devices in order to create credit profiles and issue loans for as little as a couple of dollars. These loans are usually due in 30 days, and they charge rates that, were they to be annualized, would often amount to 100% interest. Safaricom has its own loan products, including one called fuliza, which allows you to make purchases on M-Pesa even if you lack the digital funds to do so. So fuliza will offer you an advance and then charge you a daily rate until you repay. Such products are incredibly common, with millions of users needing short-term credit to get by. And while it's not the focus of this talk, it's worth flagging, not least because of Jayati's work on related topics, that the turn to digital debt in Kenya has much to do with the situation of the government's own sovereign debt. The state is lurching from one lender to the next, trying to stay solvent, and in part of that is the increased marketization of daily life in Kenya. So as a result, Kenyans are forced to buy time through digital debt in order to make do in a situation of increasing cost of living and decreasing real income. So Kenyan commentators, like the columnist in this recent article in the Kenyan Business Daily, speak of the fuliza economy, explicitly linking the shared predicament of the state and popular indebtedness. So I'm happy to discuss that further, perhaps in the discussion, but I want to focus for the next 10 minutes or so on the functioning of these fintech apps. One of the most exceptional characteristics is how they take a deep interest in the intimate details of popular life. But before doing so, I think perhaps we should step back and start with the ethnographic, with the fieldwork to lay the stage for analysis. So in June or July of 2019, Emma and I were at a pub in downtown Nairobi. We were a few drinks in, we were sitting at a cramped table with a couple of on-again, off-again students at the University of Nairobi. One of them, Victor, had just suggested that he needed to head home. He gestured to his wallet. He said, the matter is out of my hands, I have to go. And yet his friend James cajoled him, shouting fuliza, fuliza across the table of bottles. And Safaricom's fuliza service at this point was only a few months old. It was launched in January of that year, but it was already part of the vernacular. And in this case, yelling fuliza across the table was a demand to draw on the future, to draw on the opportunity of future income in order to continue socializing in the present today. So empty wallets be damned, there was a good time to be had, and digital debt could make it happen. Sitting quietly in people's pockets, analyzing their call records, their M-Pesa spending, fuliza is building intimate relations with users, coming to computationally know the credibility of would-be borrowers in order to modulate how much credit is offered to them. But this is intimacy on an industrial scale. In the first week alone, fuliza lent the equivalent of 10 million US dollars. And I think one of the remarkable things about this moment is that when they introduced us to this pub, it was as a site of familiarity. They said, this is our local, despite the fact that they all lived a bus ride away. They could leave their bags there, they explained to us, knowing that the waitresses would look after them. In fact, they told us that they could count on the waitresses to cover their tabs in cases where they were short, the waitresses using their tips to pay until the guys could scrounge together enough money to pay back the waitresses. So in other words, what's notable about this moment was that there was ostensibly no reason to invoke fuliza. They had other routes to continue the night. But the digital lending algorithm was importantly different than casual indebtedness among friends. Now, there could be many reasons why the app was preferred in that moment. Perhaps they already owed the waitress. Perhaps it was better to bank her goodwill for the future. Perhaps they knew she was hard up that week. In contrast, they knew that fuliza would lend as long as they were not already in default with the app. So in a series of important books, Parker Shipton, an anthropologist, has delineated how Kenyans living near Lake Victoria are mutually obligated to one another, a kind of generalized social condition of obligation that he calls entrustment. These reciprocities are not without their limits and their ambiguities. They can slip into animosity and resentment if they're not managed carefully or if they're subject to undue stress. But overall, Shipton paints this convincing portrait of how social grace and norms are predicated on the extended investment in interpersonal relationships that are equally personal and fiduciary. So it's this sort of sensibility, this entrustment, that undergirds the pub scene that I've laid out there, where bags could be left, where tabs could be covered. And fuliza enters into this social indebtedness. So on the one hand, enrolling the algorithm was a way to continue socializing. It was a way to continue building well-lubricated social relations. But on the other hand, these sorts of digital debt services are something of a substitute. It isn't that fuliza is a one-to-one replacement. When fuliza buys around, it works differently than when a waitress buys around. For instance, we spoke to many people who prefer digital loans because you don't have to have the embarrassment of asking someone for financial assistance. Many people also pointed to another difference. They expressed a concern in 2019 when we were doing this work that fintech apps were insufficiently mutualist. They were engaged instead in a form of extraction. And it's In the sorts of entrustment, in contrast, in the sorts of entrustment that Parker Shipton has written about, everyone is eventually going to be both a debtor and a creditor. So this encourages flexibility. It encourages people to be flexible with the due dates. It encourages people to rework the terms on which a debt might be issued, sometimes converting a debt into a gift because it couldn't be repaid. In contrast, fintech apps see Kenyans uniquely as borrowers. So this is the sort of difference that fintech offers. But perhaps I've gotten ahead of myself thinking about intimacy, and it's worth saying a bit about how we are thinking about intimacy and digital money. So on the one hand, we're indebted to African anthropologists who see intimacy not merely as this kind of warm domain of fellow feeling, but actually one that's very closely entangled with existential peril and risk and danger. And so here, witchcraft accusations are the kind of preeminent scene of thinking about this, because witchcraft accusations are most often directed at intimates rather than strangers. So proximity, entrustment, these are risky propositions. On the other hand, we're thinking about intimacy with feminist scholarship that theorizes intimacy not as some private domain of authentic personal relationships, but rather as a domain saturated by abstract and distant forces of domination. For Safaricom, the intimate has become a crucial frontier for accumulation. This is especially evident in the way that the corporation tracks and harvests personal data. From calls to purchases, from movement to social networks, Safaricom's nearly 30 million customers are monitored for personal and social data, which is translated into meaningful commercial insights, including the design of credit scores, promotional offerings, and new services. This is what we're calling algorithmic intimacy, a scale of detailed engagement with individuals and communities that was previously unimaginable. Digital money and associated infrastructures like M-Pesa are formative here. So the iconic use of M-Pesa in Kenya, the one that anchored their early advertisements as is pictured here, was to, quote, send money home. So Kenyans have long maintained geographically distributed family networks with most often the kind of normal mode is that rural parents living in rural areas will receive remittances from children working in Nairobi or other larger towns and cities. Previously, these remittances were sent as physical cash. Perhaps you would visit, perhaps someone would be traveling to see your parents and bring cash with them. But M-Pesa offered a way to do this virtually. And as a result, M-Pesa works as this kind of obligatory passage point. It mediates acts of obligation, acts of care, acts of support. And Safaricom is able to generate enormous profits from doing so. Moreover, because M-Pesa has displaced other means of sending money, most notably cash, it served to centralize both value and information. So consolidating remittances into one monetary infrastructure makes legible household transfers in a manner that was previously unthinkable and impossible with cash. Safaricom could now accumulate and analyze an ever-growing database for commercial insights. Where and when is money deposited? Where and when is it sent? To whom? When is it withdrawn? Who is financially tied to whom? How do these dynamics change over time? These are the sorts of questions that are now answerable. And so when we think about how money is working on and through intimacy today, I think there are perhaps three modes. The first, historically, was this act of mediating the family so that it becomes a frontier market for the corporation. This is the work of M-Pesa. The second is that you're able to capture intimate data provided for in the digitization of money, and then use that real-time information on Kenyans' habits, activities, social worlds, their aspirations, use that for the corporate accumulation. And the final is what we're thinking of in terms of animating the social. And it's here I'll say some closing words. So in discussing fuliza above, I suggested that digital debt intervenes into social relations. But it's not that it ends everyday entrustment among friends and family. It's by no means the case that Kenyans are uniquely turning to digital debt. Instead, what I think we see is that family and friends are serving as a backstop for an overburdened debtor. As a result, they serve as a sort of subsidy for predatory lenders. So when we were doing our work in 2019, the crisis of digital debt was already evident. Our interlocutors spoke of being enslaved and extorted by these lenders, and this was only exacerbated by COVID-19. Now, borrowers who get in over their head can default. Many do, but there are limits to that option. More commonly, it seems, people turn to family and friends for help. And this latter practice represents another way that intimate economies are incorporated and capitalized by lenders. So, an example. One woman we got to know explained to us that her credit limit had recently dropped from 30,000 shillings to 1,600 shillings. So we said, why? What happened? And she said, normally I don't like debt, but she had to borrow on behalf of someone else who had exhausted their own digital credit limit. Quote, I knew they would not repay me in time, but I thought I'll get the cash from my other work or I'll be able to repay the loan some other way. But she missed the deadline, and as a result, her creditworthiness was knocked down. So why, Emma and I asked, why did you take this loan for this person if you knew they wouldn't be able to repay you? And so she paused, and she said, they're my cousin, and they've taught me so many skills. We've, quote, done life together. There was, in other words, a lifetime of mutual indebtedness, a lifetime of entrustment that was incommensurate with the risk and the actual loss of money or a credit score. She acknowledged that it could be a mistake, but she trailed off. She shrugged her shoulders, and I think marking the kind of ambiguous emotions and sensibilities that are characteristic of interpersonal trust. Her story was not unique. We spoke to many Kenyans who have bailed out their friends and family, and therefore bailed out the lenders. And they've often been approached with shame to help people in such situations. Helping out is not easy, but the costs of not helping out are higher, not least because it would represent a default on those intimate relationships, not merely a default on a financial debt. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for this wonderful presentation. And now we turn to Lana.
Thank you. Let me do my Zoom setup. All right, great. So this is going to be sort of a mini book talk of my book that came out about a year and a half ago, but got kind of eaten by COVID, and as well as with some new work sprinkled in. So I should start by saying that I situate my study of media within my study of money within my own discipline, which is media and communication studies. Money communicates value. I pay you $20, my account is debited and yours credited. And of course, those transactions don't happen telepathically. Instead, they are enacted through media and infrastructures, which are always instantiations of meaning and power relations. And I should note that my focus here is not on money broadly defined, but on money in its most communicative modality, payment, which Bill Maurer calls the plumbing of modern economies. Payment technologies aren't just economic, they also have the communication politics. Who gets to control and profit from communication infrastructure, who gets to access it on what terms, and what kind of traffic gets to travel over it and what doesn't. What we think of as the technologies of money have long tracked alongside what we think of as the technologies of communication. Print money follows the same stories we tell about print culture more generally. Like the newspaper, it shored up the nation state as what Benedict Anderson called an imagined community. Some of today's major payment companies, like American Express and Wells Fargo, started off not in financial services, but in mail, competing with the United States Federal Post Office to ship letters, checks, and gold across an expanding territory. I often ask audiences what this fourth picture is, with its rotary phone, card swiper, and keypad, and usually get blank stares, although sometimes somebody knows. But it's a dial-up modem with a dial-up modem powered point of sale system. The very same technologies used to build the early internet were used to build the card networks. And as an elder millennial, when I was a little kid, I can remember mom pop shops having to hang up the phone in order to swipe a card. And indeed, you can still hear modem noises coming out of certain sketchy ATMs. And of course, today, mobile phones and social media are the site of innovation for our communicative world, including money. It's really clear that money is media when we look at paper money from the symbolic level. The design of state currencies tells us something about how nations would like to be seen. And indeed, the British Museum's paper money curator, Virginia Hewitt, therefore understands print money as offering an unparalleled opportunity for officially sanctioned propaganda to color the recipient's view. Anthropologist Robert John Foster describes how Melanesians understood paper money as the skin of the state, the site where they might look for news about relationships to the powerful forces brought by contact with white people and their institutions. As we rethink money as media, it's important, though, to look beyond the somewhat obvious example of paper money and questions of representation. Digital infrastructures, too, have structures of feeling, and infrastructures, as Paul Edwards argues, act like laws. He writes, to live within the multiple interlocking infrastructures of modern societies is to know one's place in the gigantic systems that both enable and constrain us. So how do the infrastructures of money ensure that we know our place? Communication through money knits us together in a shared economic world, what I call a transactional community. I call that shared reality a community because it is a way of being together that arises from communication, from countless transactions. Money is a creature of network effects. In order for it to work, everyone has to recognize it as money. A transactional community is therefore a community of shared belief. We accept money, it is only valuable, because we have a sense of what institutions authorize it, who else will accept it and where, and that they will accept it tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. When we exchange money, we agree not just on its quantity, but its meaning, our imbricated senses of identity, geography, temporality, value, politics, and practice. And so if money is, as various scholars across fields have asserted, like language, then transactional communities delineate who is able to talk with one another, to participate in the conversation, what forms of hierarchy, inclusion, and exclusion are built into the terms of that conversation. In the Enlightenment Project, money became the object of market democratic governance. Transactional communications were yoked to nation states. State currency then, a universal, public, print media, is a mass media form, with systems painstakingly designed for millions of people, interpolated as citizens or members of a polity to use. It is one of those big public infrastructures of modernity, indeed like the federal post office or highway system. Today, payment is increasingly being produced, practiced, and understood as a form of social media. Social media works by recognizing the social in payments and enclosing it, as Kevin perfectly demonstrated. As Silicon Valley discovers payment, they're doing so according to social media business logics. Many companies are hoping to harness the promise of transactional big data. These systems are governed according to practices native to Silicon Valley, such as click-through terms of service agreements. They are organized according to economic arrangements also native to Silicon Valley, such as venture capitalism. The goal of fintech is to disrupt payment by redirecting the flow of payment revenue and data through Silicon Valley's digital warehouses and toll roads. In designing payments for the internet era, fintech companies have created layers and layers of complication and often quite kludgy new systems that sit on top of or ride the rails of old ones. Any person who wants to get paid electronically is beholden to systems governed in ways that are siloed and surveillance, according to rules that are inconsistently enforced, experimental, opaque, and offer little recourse for contestation. And in turn, we see a shift from mass transactional communities, imagined anyway as matched to the scope and scale of the nation state, to what could be called social transactional communities, niche and siloed. So quickly, I want to offer two illustrative examples from my research that demonstrate ways in which social media remediates the mass media of state-issued currency, creating new transactional communities. The first being a student at an elite university from the Bronx who uses Venmo at school, but cash at home, and describe constantly code switching between the two very different transactional worlds as instantiated in apps. And second, groups of young American professionals who go abroad on vacation and transact amongst themselves in Venmo, but designate one member of their group to interact with the locals and master and deal in and touch the local currency. In response to some of these perils, we're seeing more and more people attempting to use technology to create new transactional communities according to different logics. Many of these visions for the future of transactional communities are unlinked from the political and territorial structures of nationhood. Zimmel argued that money is a claim upon society, but as sociologist Nigel Dodd points out, it is far from obvious that the society Zimmel had in mind when he was describing was equivalent to the nation state. If society is not a fixed concept, the logic goes, then money too can similarly be fluid. All of these visions are, on some level, a vision for what happens after liberal market democracy. Indeed, all crypto projects are characterized by futurity. At their core, they're an attempt to summon an alternative techno-economic future in the present. They promise a range of possible futures. In some, cryptocurrencies are valuable because the blockchain systems they entail have triumphed over their centralized and surveillant incumbents. In other versions, existing financial and governmental institutions have become so authoritarian or so incompetent, or both, that cryptocurrencies are necessary to sustain economic and communicative freedom. Indeed, all of these, as I said, they're all entail some sort of vision for what comes after market liberal democracy. But some of these cryptocurrencies are also scam currencies, fostering scam communities and offering scam futures. In my forthcoming New Media and Society article on crypto scams, I describe how cryptomanias can be seen as a frenzy to bring about a future driven by a collective that doesn't always really believe in that future, or at least is ambivalent about that future. Indeed, when I talk to people in crypto, they tell me again and again to beware of everyone else that I'm interviewing or reading. The thing you have to understand, they say, is that you can't trust anything anyone says because everyone is just pumping their bags. In this context, pumping your bags, inflating the value of your own crypto investment, is indistinguishable from promoting your vision for a better world. A true believer is indistinguishable from a shill, and on the other hand, a shill is indistinguishable from a rational actor, someone trying, perhaps desperately, to protect their investment, perhaps even their life savings. But there are other powerful transactional communities emerging that are directly aligned with the nation state. A so-called everything app, WeChat, is used in China for everything. WeChat users can message friends, read news articles, play games, order food and car services, apply for visas, and of course, pay. But the transactional community of WeChat is more geographically spread than the geography of China. At Caesars Casino in Vegas, for example, Chinese tourists can pay for everything except for gambling with WeChat. As the marketing director of Caesars said, we want to do this for our Chinese customers to make them feel at home. For Chinese tourists, WeChat is home, just as Venmo is for American tourists or Cash App is in the Bronx. We are also seeing the emergence of digital currencies officially tied to nation states, CBDCs. Some CBDCs advocates see it as offering the possibility of anti-surveillance payment system. Others are seeing it as doing the exact opposite. CBDC is at present a term with a lot of rhetorical flexibility. It is not yet settled what shape they will take. The big question really around CBDCs is how to design, if at all possible, is how to design a payment media in the public interest that does all the things cash theoretically does well as the things cash doesn't. But first, we have to agree on the meaning of public interest, let alone marshal the political will to achieve it. I'd like to end with a quick vignette from the 2009 novel The City in the City by China Mieville, in which he imagines a bizarre landscape simultaneously occupied by two distinct cities. Although the cities are physically located in the same geography, they experience two different places. They're fully imposed, yet invisibly balkanized. From birth, residents of each city learn to unsee the other city and its people. They are disciplined to live their lives in only one city, completely separated from the other. Each city has its own distinct character, and should you dare to see them both, you would know citizens of each city by their gait, their affect, and their mode of payment. Money is one of the ways that the border between the two distinct realities is maintained. The City in the City is a work of fantasy, and also, it's worth noting, a great police procedural. But it is a fantasy that is an exaggeration of mundane life in cities. We're disciplined to unsee the people and places we aren't meant to see. We all live our lives in bubbles, in cities within cities. Money forms, in real life, as in the novel, produce and trace the boundaries of these worlds, these transactional communities. If I were in Berkeley in real life, I probably would have booked my hotel room using my rewards credit card. I would have done so through a web portal that's different than what non-rewards guests do. I would be charged a different rate. I would wait in a different line to check in. I would be treated differently by the front desk clerk. I may be given a little mini bottle of water that a non-rewards guest would not have been given. I would stay in a room on a designated rewards guest floor. I would have access to different breakfasts, different common areas, different Wi-Fi networks. These hotels are not, to use Mieville's term, cleaved, but they are crosshatched. The same could be said in other places where transactional communities make themselves apparent. We do not yet know the shape of tomorrow's transactional media, nor the terrain of its transactional communities. Those that are emerging seem to be the social media of money, private, surveilled, rooted in data-driven business models. Some are highly hierarchical and segmented, others are universal and mass. Most require trusting unaccountable corporations and governments with our money and our data, our ability to pay and be paid. Some are total scams. Their segmentation could mean that you're living in a totally different world than the person sitting next to you. Their plurality could mean that your transactional life becomes variegated, omnivorous, constantly shifting between different monies, different currencies, and different identities. If money is, as anthropologists describe, the skin of the state, these payments forms create new ways of communicating, touching and not touching, being in bodies, new states, and new skins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lana. I can see all the directions we can take the Q&A later on. By the way, this is a reminder to you all that if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A and we'll get to them shortly. But before that, we have Jayati's presentation.
Thank you so much, Marion. And what fascinating presentations to follow. Those were really very, very interesting. And I think both Kevin and Lana have touched on some of these fundamental aspects of money that economists often forget. And I just want to remind everybody, ultimately the point that both of them raised, that money is really all about trust and perception. It only exists of and between human minds. It doesn't exist out of that. And because of that, because it's about trust, perception, and the ability to influence, it is ultimately about power. And so you cannot extract money relationships from power relationships. And it's not just in terms of who has money and who doesn't, but which forms of money you trust and how you trust them. And that, I think, is at the heart of the whole discussion of particularly this shift from cash to more digital means of money as well. So let's just think, the classic functions of money that economists talk about. It's the transactions function and the store of value. And it's only very recently that it's been perceived that digital monies can also be stores of value. Bitcoin, for example, which is essentially really just a giant speculative bubble, a sort of modern day equivalent of the tulip bubble, really, are ways in which you are trying to transfer what is ultimately a payments function. You're trying to transfer the store of value capacity onto a payments function in the form of the digital money. And this shift to digital money, it's a very interesting shift because I think all of the things that were just outlined by Kevin, the creation of new forms of trust, the convenience aspect, and so on, joined with the kinds of creations of networks and the social relationships that Lana outlined, these are extremely important in trying to understand both the nature of the expansion of different digitized means of transaction that we see today, and the extreme interest of states in encouraging these, and particularly in some developing countries, the obsession of states with shifting to digitized currencies and digitized transactions. I come from India, where we've actually had the largest demonetization experience in history in 2016, which was subsequently promoted as a means of shifting from a cash economy into a digital transactions world that was claimed to be one of the ostensible aims. But there's this general perception that cash is bad, cash is corrupt, cash is what criminals use and so on, or it's part of an underground economy rather than just an informal economy, which is a bit weird because in fact, you find that cash transactions continue to dominate in the world. Yes, there's a massive growth of different kinds of digitized transactions, but cash still dominates, and it dominates often in extremely otherwise post-industrial societies in which you would expect that there would be much greater digitization of all of these. Now, that's really because cash has many advantages, and the shift to digitizing often doesn't recognize the particular advantages of cash. It's true that cash is bulky, it's difficult to carry around, it requires storage. And of course, the anonymity feature has the other side of it, which is that it can also be used for criminal and other kinds of transaction and so on. But first of all, cash is flexible. It should be acceptable everywhere. Of course, depends on which currency, but broadly speaking, it's acceptable everywhere for different kinds of goods and services. It doesn't require technology to be used. That's quite important in large parts of the world, including my own country, where it's not just a digital divide, there is a connectivity divide. There's really the absence of the required connectivity that would enable these transactions to flow smoothly and painlessly. It doesn't require third-party involvement. It's really between the two parties engaged in the transaction. You don't have to have a third element, a third agent entering, an intermediary, to enable the transaction. And most of all, well, not most of all, it's private. That's one of the very, very big things. Private also means anonymous. And anonymity, yes, it's not only criminals who want it. There's one of the interesting features of demonetization, which again, I suppose is also a reflection of the lack of any kind of gendered perspective in policymaking in most countries, but particularly in India, is that when this was done, it was seen as a way of, wiping out dirty money and so on. But actually what happened is that within families, especially, women who had been storing up little cash balances over time, saving up on, household money or doing other kinds of things and saving up little cash balances to use either for their own purposes or for their children or something, keeping it away from a situation where the husband or the head of the household would use that money for their own means or whatever. They were forced to bring this out in the open, and there were many, many cases of increased domestic violence because of the fury of the household heads that all of these cash balances had been stored without their knowledge and would have been used without their knowledge. Cash anonymity goes beyond the requirements of those who would supposedly engage in quasi-legal transactions. It's fundamentally often a requirement in societies that are otherwise deeply unequal and that do not provide every agent the same kinds of freedom to engage in different kinds of transactions or to do them according to their own wishes and specifications. And most of all, and I want to highlight this, cash transactions are free. What does that mean? You're not paying for the transaction. The costs of seigniorage are borne really by the central bank in the country. The costs of cash holding are generally borne, the seigniorage costs are borne by the central bank. The benefits also accrue to the central bank and the state that backs that central bank in terms of the ability to provide that currency as a means of transaction and circulation. But that freedom, the freeness of cash means what? It means that when you move away from cash, you are really getting into transactions which require an additional layer of payment. They require an additional intermediary who's going to be paid. So all of the transactions that were highlighted by Kevin, by Lana, everything from check to credit card to debit card to online transactions to mobile money, the works, all of them require an intermediary, and that intermediary is a profit-making entity who gets a profit from this. In other words, there is an extraction from that transaction in a situation where earlier there was not this extraction. In a very odd way, because of the fact that you're now making these payments systems themselves profit centers. This is really a case of financialization of finance, as I have called it, in fact, with reference to the Indian context. This is a case where you are generating the ability to make a profit out of something that was earlier not profitable. So yes, you are gaining convenience in the shift to digital, but at the same time, you are adding costs. Fundamentally, this is therefore a regressive thing. The costs fall greater proportionately, they are higher on those who are less able to afford it. Because those who are forced to engage in digital transactions at the lower end of the income spectrum are typically those who will have to make frequent transactions. We know that the costs are actually higher proportionately. The smaller your transaction, the more frequent they are. For larger transactions, it's actually proportionately a smaller amount that you pay for the benefit of being able to engage in that transaction. So this is another means really of extraction. I loved the term that Kevin used, the predatory inclusion. And it's predatory in several ways. It's predatory certainly in terms of, the social interactions, the expansion of the profit, etc. But it's predatory from a purely economic way in terms of the extraction of rents from a particular transaction. So what you really got here in terms of a move to digital transactions is a privatization of the benefits of seigniorage. So the CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies that Lana mentioned, perhaps they are attempts by the states and central banks to claw back some of those seigniorage benefits. We can come back to that. But, the fact that we have this explosion of different means of payment, all of which involve profit-making intermediaries, really means that what we're doing is privatizing the benefits of something that was earlier seen as a social cost and something under social control. So in addition, when you're looking at the sort of convenience benefits of digital transactions, you have to counterbalance these with these other features, with the cost, certainly, with the loss of privacy, which as I mentioned, extends to many different levels, with the fact that, these are all things which are fraught with the possibility of fraud, identity theft, different kinds of problems associated with these online transactions or mobile transactions, but also, and very, very importantly, with the issue of data, surveillance, monitoring, and control. And I want to highlight this because I think this is really, really important. We have increasingly a world in which, as I think everybody knows by now, if you're not paying for something, you are the product, right? And we know that trade in data globally surpassed trade in goods in 2015. It's been going even more during the pandemic. And why is there so much trade in data? Because data is hugely profitable. Data are a massive source. The information associated with the data, it's not just for targeted advertising. It's not just because Airbnb will tell you where you must visit the next time or something. It's really because of the manifold uses of data for commercial purposes and also by states. The 360-degree monitoring actually that you can get once you once you have the awareness of all of a person's transactions, it's well beyond anything that we can or sufficiently begin to imagine. The degree of surveillance, monitoring, and therefore control that is enabled not just for the big giant corporations, not just for the big companies that everybody loves to hate, but also for states. I think this is something which is a huge aspect that we are simply not able to confront with the importance that it deserves. And I come from a country, but I'm not alone. Huh? Many developing countries, many countries across the world are increasingly using this capacity to monitor transactions, to collect information about people and to survey them, and then to use that for their own ends. And those ends are not necessarily democratic. They're not for the social good at all. So in other words, we have to really think about this whole thing about the digital world in a more complex way, in a way in which we recognize that while money is based on trust, digital money also therefore based on digital trust in that digital entity which is enabling the transaction, it is simultaneously reflecting a lack of trust of both corporations and state in us, in the agents of that thing. So we have to consider, if you like, what this digitization of the means of payment and of circulation in general implies not only for social relationships, I think that was beautifully highlighted by Kevin, or for broader social networks, but also for power relationships, and how much power in general we are ceding as we give into these different forms of digital transaction for the purpose of convenience, or often because those become the only alternatives that are available to us for forms of payment. So I just want to go back to this, anonymity, flexibility, reliability. These used to be seen as the advantages of cash. Now, increasingly, and this is also something that is widespread in the media and purposefully sort of pushed by states, cash is seen as the bad guy. Cash is what criminals hold. Cash is, of course, it's lumpy. You can't carry around suitcases full of cash to pay for a house and all of that. But cash is seen as the site for unwanted or socially undesirable transactions. The other side of it, the fact that most business crime, white collar crime, actually occurs in digital transactions rather than in cash, is generally not so widely understood. But also the kinds of freedom that we give up with cash. I think we simplistically assume that the new modernity involves less and less cash and more fintech, more and more digital, more and more reliance on newer forms of online or digital payment. And in a sense, we are perhaps missing out on what this also means for human freedom. But let me stop here because I think there are so many questions that the other two have raised that there's bound to be a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati. That was also wonderful. So we have a whole bunch of questions. If everybody, Kevin, if you want to come in as well. I guess I will start with perhaps a question that is sort of, that I read in some of the comments up there in the Q&A, which is about sort of, the regulation, the financial regulation. We haven't really talked about that very much, but, a lot of these technologies developed in sort of a regulatory vacuum. And actually more than that, they developed in a way where, they were encouraged very much by international organizations, often by states. And so, how do we think about that? So we talked about predatory inclusion, but, whenever we read reports from international organizations, what we see is, these are means of financial inclusion, right? So there is, there are these two narratives, one coming from the industry, but not simply the industry, a lot of really important political actors. And then, of course, the one coming from social scientists like us, who have a sort of different interpretation. So how do we think about, financial, the way in which institutions have encouraged the development of these new payment systems? So I guess I posed a question to all three of you, perhaps in different ways, and then I'll go back to, more specific questions. Yeah. Perhaps, Kevin, you want to begin?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think you're right to pick up on this theme, and I heard it in both Lana and Jayati's comments. I mean, one thing that's happened is a kind of evacuation of the public interest, or a capacity to speak in the public interest. So, I would also be keen to kind of see, Lana, in your work and Jayati in the Indian context, is there someone able to speak for the public other than the central bankers who are trying to do a kind of decent CBDC version? Because in Kenya, it's very hard to speak in the kind of the general interest, except in the idiom of developmentalism, which I feel to be utterly compromised. And this is in part about the kind of economism of the public interest in Kenya. It's in part because the state, as you suggest, Marion, it's not merely that the market is seen to be the locus of kind of innovation. It's that the state, the austere, incapacitated state now understands its purpose to be to govern through the market, through market actors. I mean, it's why we're interested in this notion of parastatal, a kind of unfashionable term, but it's actually about this kind of shifting trading zone between the state and the corporation, in which these technologies are worked out, which may speak a bit to Vinay's question in the chat about, is this about the kind of state abrogating its duty? I actually think it's a much more purposeful delegation to the corporation, which has the effect of removing any central locus of accountability, right? So Safaricom is able to say it's the central bank's role. The central bank is able to say it's Safaricom's role, and never will a kind of citizen concern be heard. But I'm sensitive to hearing from others as well.
Yeah, I mean, as a way of answering this, I will think of one thing I can think about is some of the recent work that I've been doing somewhat embedded among technologists and policymakers who are trying to think through the potential for CBDCs, and cautiously so. I mean, it sometimes seems like everybody wants a CBDC except for central bankers, and one of the reasons why they seem to not want CBDCs is because they realize the tremendous liability, both to their reputation and their ability to function, that creating a new payment system produces. And there are many, I referenced the idea that in the United States anyway, but I can speak with certainty to the United States, but certainly elsewhere, payment systems are kludgy, layers upon layers of messy infrastructures, truly like multi-sided markets with all different kinds of actors in organizations providing different inputs to conduct a payment. Like we swipe a card, but under the surface, so much is going on in order to make that happen. And central banks are kind of loath to take on all of that. And they, I think, accurately understand that they don't necessarily have the capacity to do so. And I think there's some concern that if they FOMO their way into it and fail spectacularly, like think about in the United States the marketplace exchanges for for Obamacare, for health insurance, and how terrible those websites and interfaces are, then that will just open the door for completely relinquishing the capacity for something like the public to offer something in the way of digital payments. And as an example of kind of how difficult it is to sort of puzzle out the public interest, chargebacks and other kinds of dispute resolutions are the one thing you get with electronic payments that you don't, for the most part, that you don't get with cash. If I give you cash and you've defrauded me, oh well, you have the cash, our transaction is over, that's it. And we seem to be relatively okay with that in the cash world, but in the electronic world, things rapidly get more complicated very quickly. But if you want any kind of dispute resolution whatsoever, there has to be an intermediary that is responsibilized for that. And once you are responsibilizing an intermediary for dispute resolution, you're talking about underwriting risk. And once you're talking about underwriting risk, you're talking about predictive analytics. And once you're talking about predictive analytics, we've ramified to the point where it's really difficult for the kind of data imperative and function creep of surveillance capitalism to not kind of wend its way in. So it's much more complicated to determine exactly how to act. And I find myself in some ways with a lot less certainty than I had, a number of years ago. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jayati. Do you want to weigh in on this point?
Well, no, I think both of them have answered it really well. I mean, yes, absolutely. There's a whole substructure in any payment system, which includes the interoperability and all of those other issues that Lana mentioned. And that's the great advantage of cash, right? Currencies, you don't have to do all that. It's sort of doing it on its own in itself. So the question then is, why does a central bank want to get in on it at all? You can see why in China they would want to do it, because they want to prevent the excessive power and rise of fintech companies, and they want state control, both, right? And of course, this is like the perfect way to get both. So in a democracy where you are much, let's say, more cautious about issues of privacy, surveillance, etc., what would be the advantage of a central bank digital currency? Well, I mean, my friend Katerina Pistor argues that you have to do it again for the same reason of preventing the excessive power of fintech, because of the very fact that being the financial intermediary in a digital world gives you access to data which is unprecedented and holistic. And you cannot allow corporations that are clearly not in the public interest to have that power. How do you design a payment structure that keeps that absence? Frankly, I don't know. I mean, I have seen something that's been put into the US Congress. They're trying to create a digital currency at the federal level. And the Treasury's kind of equivalent digital currency. I'm not so sure it can actually preserve privacy. I'm not sure how it can be done. But I don't know, maybe Lana and Kevin know more about it. But.
I really appreciate you bringing in democracy and the real political questions underlying these kinds of power formations. Let me move now to some questions from the audience. So I'd like to begin perhaps with a question to Kevin. I mean, in some ways, some of this is not very new. Credit card companies have always, for a long time, have held a lot of data about us. So the question is, what's really different here? So that's the first, point. And then once Safaricom has data, what does it do with it? And so there's a question about, whether it sells its data, to other parties.
Yeah, thank you. So, I think the kind of history of credit score and FICO is really valuable. In some ways, what's happening is a kind of quantitative shift in the amount of data that's available to the banks and the telcos and the third-party fintech apps in Kenya. But given the historical absence of credit cards and the historical withholding of bank loans to most Kenyans, it is a kind of qualitative shift. And I think it is important in kind of marshaling the criticism that I have to acknowledge Kenyans want access to finance. They need access to finance. That line between kind of social compulsion and authentic desire is very hard to suss out. They're both, kind of operating there. And the kind of convenience that Jayati kind of emphasizes of M-Pesa is real. And, I don't want to kind of dismiss that. But what I think is important and why kind of, comparative analysis of, say, Visa or MasterCard, let alone, the mortgage, the home mortgage is important, is because we can see a more kind of complicated democratic debate about the importance and the limits and the dangers of finance. And that has been occluded by the kind of financial inclusion discourse and ideology in a place like Kenya. And as a result, the sorts of regulatory conversations, the sorts of public debate are very different. But I think a kind of comparative lens is really helpful because it would allow us to ask questions about, say, cooperatives as a place where capital might be made available. It might allow us to ask questions about state banks as a place where more patient capital could be made available. And it would allow us to ask questions about what muscular sorts of financial regulations and what sorts of models from elsewhere might be used to limit usury, to extend the timelines of repayments, to think about dispute resolution, which is, Lana, not something even on my radar and is really helpful. So all of those are, I think the point of laying out the criticism is in part to insist that we don't need to limit ourselves to what came before or what we have, but there actually might be a model of digital finance which might meet people's needs, but without kind of doing this more repressive indebting work. And then just kind of quickly on the data, Safaricom get on into a little hot water some years ago when they were selling data before there was a kind of clear regulatory framework for doing so. They stepped back and then they sold scorecards instead to say, basically they sold credit scores rather than the underlying data. But there is now a Data Protection Act in Kenya. And my sense of these things is that they actually further the kind of commodification of data rather than limiting the commodification of data. They add a kind of clear framework that large corporations and their lawyers can then use to figure out how do we create a data commodity that won't get us, fined. So yes, it's happening, and I expect it to be happening much more now that that law has gone into effect this year or late last year.
Thank you very much. So we have two questions from Vinay Brandon, one for Lana, one for Jayati. So I'll just take them in order. So Lana, I am a huge fan of your work and an apostle of your oeuvre. I want you to riff off or speculate on the new dynamics of infrastructural mutualism as blockchain dreams come to reconfigure public versus private through the design imaginaries of CBDCs. If the social of cryptos, the social of just us is displaced with a new infrastructure of state entrustment, what kind of transactional community are we inaugurating through this parliament of code? Does its centralization as res publica fundamentally alter the politics of intermediation that the design utopias of digital cash were meant to obviate?
That's a remarkable question in many ways. I think merely posing the question is it furthers the conversation. I think, and I'll say I've never had an apostle before, so thank you for that. I think I'll answer the question by saying that my sense is that in certain parts of crypto there has been a more lively and more all-encompassing set of kind of collaborative, speculative design fiction than there has been around CBDCs. And I think that if CBDCs are to attain anything like, their aspirations, then in terms of serving the public interest, then I think it requires some collaboration with both, thinking about the, as, Kevin points out, some of the cooperative movements, both implicit and explicit, whether that's credit unions or, explicitly cooperative groups of other kinds. I don't know. I think that possibly best case scenario, CBDCs are extremely boring, and worst case scenario, they're. Yeah, I'm not sure. Your question is super interesting, and I'm not really sure how to answer it. I'll just put it that way, rather than rambling on.
Thank you, Lana. So Jayati, we have a long question here. I guess I'd like to perhaps rephrase it a little bit around, so you said something, you said that cash is now the bad guy. And then, a few years ago, Bitcoin was the bad guy because Bitcoin was, and still is, I guess, in many ways. But we're seeing sort of a transformation here where, cash is increasingly delegitimated. And then, of course, we see, crypto and other kinds of Bitcoin being now, there was just an announcement that BlackRock is going to start, proposing services for cryptocurrency. So, now we are sort of moving in sort of this sort of different direction, right? So I guess the question is about the sort of this process of legitimizing it is very much a power move as well, right? So I'd like, since you are the one who really brought up power relations, I'd like you to sort of talk a little bit about that and the sort of the intertwining of these processes with sort of now increasingly Wall Street finance?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. And this also, I mean, the question itself was fascinating. And I think your take on it is also extremely interesting. So let me, take off from where Lana ended. I'm with Keynes. I think money should be boring. Finance should be boring. Digital money should also be boring. That's the purpose. When it is not boring is when you have crises, right? To me, okay, maybe I'm just being really really boring empirical economist here, but to me, the Bitcoin is a classic bubble, right? You look at Kinderberger's big fat history of money and all those stories of bubbles and etc. And this has every element of the classic bubble. Now, the thing about a lot of these bubbles is that they are created by the powerful of different kinds of and this is absolutely the case in Bitcoin, but in general, all the sort of cryptocurrencies, the whole craze around crypto and somehow that it's different. Essentially, the sort of value of Bitcoin lies in the fact that it's fixed, right? Fixed supply. The way gold used to be valuable because it's fixed or limited or didn't grow very much kind of thing. So that's the big value of Bitcoin. Then you get sort of new spin-offs in the form of new cryptos in which the sort of essential newness about them is the fact that they're technology driven and there's blockchain technology, but most people don't know what the hell, but they say, oh my God, blockchain must be really smart because it's so 21st century. It sounds so good. So I think these are really, let's face it. I go back to the point, money is often between human minds, right? You can do anything. You can, in hyperinflationary Germany, chairs were used as money. Anything can become liquidity. It's a question of how you generate that sense of trust and et cetera, to make something liquidity or create a mania around it. I personally, maybe I'm being extreme here, but 20 years from now, people are going to be saying, my God, really? You guys fell for crypto? Wow. Because it has all the hallmarks. It's a Dutch tulip, really.
I have a slightly, go ahead,
driven by technology, but it's a Dutch tulip.
I have a slightly better answer, I think, to the question / a response in some ways to some of the other conversation, which is that I think the crucial question now is to really think about scale and interoperability and shifting between scales. So, it's either like the global or the nation state or economic territory. But I think if there's a capacity for CBDCs or other kind of payment intermediary to function at a variety of different scales, whether that is, the size of a cooperative, another, and kind of shift between national, local, and global, that's like kind of the big task. So I think about something like email, like most of the time, most of us use email, through Gmail. And so, obviously anyone else's privacy is only as good as my privacy, and my privacy is not very good because I use Gmail. But it is possible to run your own email installation. It likely won't work because you'll be caught by spam filters, but it's much more possible to run email at the kind of scale of a university or a workplace. And so I think that we need to think about the lesson I'm thinking about lately about the communicative affordances of money or comparing money to communication or thinking about money as communication is this question of scale and getting scale right, scale shifting right is like the big question I have for designers of new currency systems or payment systems as we move forward.
Just want to bring back the 5-letter Wordle word power.
Yes,
you can't
absolutely.
think about all of this without recognizing power. Sorry, Lana.
Yeah, no,
I definitely agree with you on that.
I think that there is indeed agreement on that. And one of the most interesting things to come out of this panel is actually the way in which, on the one hand, we are increasingly connected to one another. There's sort of this fluidity that is emerging that, out of course, the digital. But on the other hand, this fluidity is actually serving to create this sort of separate worlds. Lana talked about that in her example with the hotel, right? It's sort of increasingly, it's increasingly tightening us into sort of tracking us into different kinds of worlds. And on the other hand, it's also, the way Kevin was talking about what, how families, get themselves, entrapped, in this process as well. So you have these sort of new forms of power by which sort of the very socialization that should be outside of it, becomes itself, mobilized in service of sort of the profit-making goals of these of these new digital payment and lending services. So I really appreciate this wonderful conversation. Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for being here. Kevin, Lana, Jayati, thank you, Julia Zizek, for helping us really put together this panel. Thank you, Eva Seto and Chaka Pelke at Matrix behind the scenes. And well, I look forward to meeting you, and I hope that at some point we will actually meet in person.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for great moderation. Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.